So he's in part fighting with that question. And what's the rationale that he gives? Is that a hand up? That's a scratch back. All right. Yes, and you are? Stephen? He makes that interesting point, which we'll get to, that parchment lasts longer than paper. Okay, now that's one reason. It's not really the reason necessarily why it's good for monks to write, but I think it's a good point, and we'll come back to that. It's one of the things to think about. Yes? Right, there's labor involved in writing, and I think he wants to put a value on that labor in what way? Yes? Right, and why is there no better way? Well, there are those two, but there's one also I think connects back to Socrates. I mean, you're right, absolutely you're right, but there's one more that connects back to Socrates. Yes? Right, he says, look, writing gets you really engaged with the text and understand it. And how many of you have been told when you read, take notes? When you sit in class, take notes. Writing will get you to understand it, otherwise you won't. So again, they're familiar arguments, and he wants to make that point. The standard view, again, is that he didn't like print, so he's often held up in general books as this guy comes along and he's a silly fuddy-duddy old monk and he just doesn't like print. In fact, again, it wasn't the case. He says, my greatest pleasure to own and to know all books I ever saw and which I knew to have appeared in print, he says. He said that in the past few read. My regret money was always lacking for the satisfaction of my passion for books. And in fact, while he was abbot in Sponheim, the library went from 48 books to 2,000 books. And after the printing press, these private libraries expanded dramatically. So you can see, it's very hard to pin on him the idea that he didn't like books, so it's easily done. And as people have written about him, he in fact was very adept in print. He was very good at designing books, he knew what font to choose, he engaged in a lot of battles with printed manuscripts. So he liked the text, okay. He didn't have a problem with that. There are various things, though. I mean, there is, as somebody already suggested, this internal battle that some people are saying to the monks, look, you shouldn't be bothered with all this writing. You should be praying, or you should be doing manual labor, or you should be out preaching, but this writing is kind of selfish. So he's kind of fighting that. The other corner saying, no, it's not. It's absolutely important to our lives, and that the dedicated scribe is an important person. There's another battle that's going on, and one that's going to be important to us to understand, because it's usually, again, just attributed to print, and that is the nature of book production was changing dramatically. And it was moving, although they were still manuscript, they were moving outside the monasteries. So from the 12th century or so, you could go to streets in Paris, and if you had a particular book that you borrowed and you wanted a copy of, you'd go to these people and say, copy this for me. And they no longer were religious. As Jeff said, the first Egyptian ones were specially trained scribes. Now it was becoming a general ability. So the ability to commission books, to get them written, had moved away from the monasteries. So the monasteries were kind of fighting. And they were fighting on various odds. One is that monks were becoming increasingly unpopular. As Erasmus said, monks are detested. It's considered bad luck if one crosses your path. Before the black cat, you had the black robed monk who you wanted to stay away from. They were having competing centers of learning. The university, the beginning of the university that grew up, first in Byzantium, but will leave those aside in the cathedral towns of Europe, but set themselves up in many ways in opposition to what the monks and the monasteries do. So he's fighting a corner to say, look, we're still relevant, we're still in business, we're still important to society. Whereas others are saying, no, you're not, you're going to die. There's no place for monks anymore because we're taking away what you're good at. And he saw that not only in print, but in these other centers of manuscript writing of the university. He shouldn't have worried. In fact, staying close to the printed word, the monks have managed to stay in touch with manuscript forms right down to the present, so they're still around. But he does bring up one lament for us to think about, and that is, as we heard, he makes this question about parchment. And he looks at paper, and he goes, ugh, I don't like paper. I like writing, that's fine. I actually do like books, I don't mind print. But the written word on parchment will last 1,000 years. The printed word is on paper. How long will it last? The most you can expect of a book of paper to survive is 200 years. Only time will tell. What about that claim? Again, is that just a claim that's specific to the period? Do we think he was justified in making it? Yeah.
Well, it's a similar argument that comes from what's going on now with online.
Right. You come to a new medium, and you start to say, you stick all your stuff in the cloud, and you suddenly say, well, is that going to still be there when I come back and want it? To tell you, just because Jeff was allowed to tell you his story about his first computer, I'll tell you a story about my first computer. Some 25 or more years ago, I had the opportunity to catalogue a private library in England. It was a library that had been collected since the 16th century. It was marvelous, and nobody had ever catalogued it. So I and a friend sat in. We catalogued all the books in it. And I decided I was going to be really cutting edge, so I went out and bought an Amstrad, which was a great 1982 or 3 computer that was available then. And so I catalogued the library. There's a library on an Amstrad. Now, this actually isn't the same copy, but there was a copy in the library of the Magna Carta. It had been copied in the 14th century, I think. And you could pick it up, and you could roll out, and you could read the whole thing from side to side. And you can still do that now. You can go back to that library if they let you in. There's the disk. Cannot be read. Not only can you not find a machine, but it's now corrupted. So although this stuff lasted 800 years, this didn't even make it 20. In fact, to bail myself out of that, I actually had a printed copy. The printed copy cost me a great deal because on the Amstrad, there were 2 commands. There was a command and an option command P. The option command P got you to print. The command P stood for purge. And not only did it purge, but the great thing was just to add humility, it brought each slide file up on the screen and dissolved it in front of your eyes. And I sat there and watched the library purge itself. So finally, after dealing with my own idiocy, I got a printed copy, got the backup disk, and I made what I thought was a very savvy HyperCard stack of it. And it had lots of little scripts and scrolls, so you could sort through the library. HyperCard doesn't exist anymore. So those bits are also worthless and useless. So when you hear that lament, it's something that's very pertinent to us. So let's talk a little then about the technologies of the book, because these are technological questions. So there's a kind of story, the real story, that as we look at the various technologies that people use, it has a kind of progression. It says, well, look, we began with stone, and then we moved to clay, and clay is better than stone because... Any thoughts why clay would be better than stone? Yes, sir? Right, you made it doughy and soft and made an impression in it, and then it would dry. Still the process you do with ink in the way that it dries. And so, like having to carve in stone, you can actually mark it fairly quickly. Its deficit would be over stone. So that's how yes? Sorry? Water resistance? Well, it's not water resistant. Exactly. Stone is more resistant. In fact, that's how we get lithography, by the water resistance of the stone. But yeah, so it can dissolve again. So one problem can be, it'll bake very nicely, but it'll also dissolve. Anything else? Yes? It breaks it. It snaps and breaks. So almost all sort of surviving clay things are snapped. So you also get a move to wood, although wood may in some places come first. Almost all our terms around the book actually come from terms from wood, codex, book, folio, etc. So you go to wood, you go to wax, then you get parchment and vellum, which we'll talk about a bit, papyrus, paper, palm and silk. So there's a whole series of different things that have different varieties of these properties that you can see between stone and clay. On the one hand, stone is very strong and solid, but it's not very portable. So you tend to get it where it's sort of stuck in a wall somewhere. With clay, it's lighter, can be moved about. The French, it's hard to know what to call him, sociologist, though he doesn't like to be called that. Bruno Latour has this notion of the immutable mobile. If you can use 7 words instead of 1, French sociologists will do it. What's he talking about? We're talking about the document. But it's an important point in a way, because what he wants to say is we want 2 things out of the document. We want it to be immutable. That is, we don't want it to change over time or as it moves across space. If I write a note to you, you want the note that gets there to be what I wrote. So we want it to be immutable. But for the same purpose of sending that note, we want it to be mobile. That is, we want it to be able, and the heavier and the more immovable it is, the less useful it is. And there's a kind of trade-off between these two. We're always looking for something that is either more immutable or more mobile. And as we move through these, we can see there are different trade-offs. Paper and parchment, very mobile, but they as Tritemius says, they decay, they collapse. Bits are wonderfully, wonderfully mobile, but how immutable they are is problematic. So this question is good. The way that some of those changes are explained is geographically. You can say, for instance, that, so the question is this a matter simply of a linear progression, or is it one place, something was more convenient than another? Well, that's true. Papyrus grew in the Nile Valley, and therefore, at the Library of Alexandria, that's what you made your books of. You could knead the sheets, the stalks, into something like paper, whereas the great rival library of Pergamon didn't have access to that, so it used vellum or parchment. And so we have the two sort of rivals there, partly by geography. Do you think that, whereas if you look at India, you get palm. And so, in fact, I was very nicely given, they still exist, the Patachitra, which is still written on palm. Now, there's one way to say, well, it's just purely to do with locality. There's one to do with, say, well, no, it's a technological progression. What other reasons do you think might be thrown in there if you just look at those countries? Leave China out for the moment. We'll get to China in a moment. Particularly if you say, well, look, papyrus is in the Nile Valley, so they've got a monopoly on that, and they're not going to let it out. So the next best option is parchment, which we make from sheepskin. All right, so we use sheepskin, get out, we dry it, and then we can write on. Okay, so any thoughts? Why is that not the next best option for some people? Yes, sir. No, it wouldn't indeed. It wouldn't sell the papyrus to other people. But we assume that sheep can sort of get, you can steal a sheep, you can rustle a sheep if you want. That's a good point, but not right. Any other? Well, some people just don't like slaughtering animals. And the idea that to have a text that we're going to write down, I should slaughter animals in countries where eating and slaughtering animals is not approved of. And in fact, it's a reasonable question. If you look at this, to make one fine Bible with a flock of perhaps 300 sheep. I mean, it wasn't simply a matter of going out and sacrificing your one ewe. It was taking whole hordes of the things and slaughtering them and preparing them. So you could see that people looked for other means to get around. And in fact, one of the countries that produced other means to get around was China. Here they were, the great technological leader. Usually often you'll see it attributed to Cai Lun. That's probably not right. Probably there was paper around quite a lot before that, but it might have been that he improved on manufacturing techniques. But people think it goes back to about 200 years before the Common Era. Probably 100, 200 years there was paper in China. Now, here we are in the techie West, but when things stack up and we look at the spread of paper, it took an awful long time for Europeans to start using paper. It was actually around, but they didn't use it for a while. They stuck to parchment, though it came all the way down. And in fact, if you look at Western Europe, Spain gets it first. Anyone suggest why Spain gets it first? Exploration was a little before the explorations, so it's a good point. Yeah. The Moors, okay, so it was the south of Spain was Islamic. And Islam, almost as soon as Islam came into being, picked up paper very quickly. And it spread through Islam. It spread to Jewish communities. They lived, but they were slow in many ways to get it among Islamic and Christian communities. Finally, it came to Western Europe. Now, there's another thing that we have to bear in mind. It's not simply the question of paper, and we can have flat sheets of paper. The question is, what form did it take? And I mentioned before, there's a kind of missing technology in the story, or many of the stories, and that is, when do we go from the scroll, which is what Phaedrus has, rolled up piece of paper like that, to what we talked about before, the codex, which is now the standard book. Now here again, there are sort of technological stories. I told you, Chartier says, look, this is a real significant moment. But why does it come about? You begin with different kinds of just wooden sheets clapped together and then tied with a piece of string. You can go on to various sheets of paper tied together as a piece of string. But then you can get more sophisticated. You have the scroll, but then you can start to have the folio, which is the first fold in a book, and then you get 4 pages. Or you can fold once again, and with a little bit of grim tearing, you now have an 8-page book. And in fact, you can fold once again and get a 16-mo book, as they're called, if you tie off the top here. And all you need to do is to sew into the inside of the margin. So this begins in many ways just in private books, people taking a piece of paper and making it comfortable themselves, but gradually it spread so much that Jessica Brantley says, look, Gutenberg really wasn't beginning anything. It began with the appearance of the codex. That's when the nature of communication really changed. So the question is, well, how did that come about? There is the argument we looked at before from Kilgore is an evolutionary argument. You get the flat sheet, then you get the roll, but finally people need so much information that you get the codex. So it's again, the codex comes along and it's superior. Now, we can look back at eras, it's hard to see this picture, but this is from Pompeii, and it's actually a time when the two overlap. That guy is holding a scroll, and that guy is holding an early wooden codex, which are pieces of wood strapped together so that you can read them. And the two existed together for actually a very long time. Well, we can say, what are the advantages of the book? Let me go through them quickly because I'm falling behind already. Well, one is random access. The scroll, you have to unroll the whole thing to find a passage towards the end, whereas with the codex, you can just dive in wherever you choose. So that's useful. You can hold it in one hand, because the scroll tends to need 2 to be read with. So that's convenient. You can use 2 sides of the paper. So that's convenient. You have pagination. So you can refer to particular pages. You can have marginalia. That is, you can write in the margin. You can have footnotes. You can have indexes. This is a nice thing. It's not up there. Where is it now? The manucule is how people used to do their marginalia. They put these great hands in the margin pointing to the important tests or manucules. So these all seem to be technological advantages for the book. So the codex should wipe out the scroll, no question. One thing to bear in mind is that when we hear these arguments, I mentioned it before, we can often trivialize the other technology and make it seem absurd. I mean, they were very useful things. The scroll was handy. It was very easy to pick up, to carry, to walk about with. You could stack them fairly happily, as you can see up there. So a lot of the things that people say against it, well, yeah, there's a lot of convenience to it, too. It had pages, too. We tend to think of it as just one long script. In fact, as I make point in a moment, we always see in these films, people open the scroll and go, hear ye, hear ye. In fact, you always read the scroll that way around. And in fact, it would have pages stuck to it. And the nice thing about sticking pages in, you could add more over time, which you can't do to the Codex book. People think it's all continuous. In fact, it had divisions with lots of, it began with that word incipit in the beginning, which in fact is the word that Trithemius' text begins with, so it's stayed over, but we get that from there. Explicits to the end. It had colophons, which told you where you come to the end of a particular work. It had syllaboi, which are those strange little triangles hanging off the end there, which told you what was in the scroll and who had written it. So it wasn't quite as trivial or as foolish a device as it's easy to make out. As I say, we often get the idea of how to read it the wrong way around. In fact, that sort of elegant lady is showing you how you really read a scroll from side to side. And so many of these things which we attribute looking back to the Codex, in fact, were available in the scroll. Also, there's a question of whether it was better suited for paper. In fact, people say no. Look, the Codex was just as good with parchment or vellum as it was with paper. The scroll was just as good with paper as it was with parchment or vellum. So that isn't the story. And yet, if we take those earlier dates that I showed you for paper, and you can see the great technological advances in the East coming very, very slowly to the West, and you put them alongside the progression of the Codex, it's very hard to see a pattern emerging. Western Europe, Christian Europe, which was very, very slow to get paper, moved very, very quickly to get the Codex. So if it's just a matter of a better technology, they were standing on their head, whereas the East, in particularly China, Korea, India, and Japan, come very late to the Codex. It's almost not until the age of printing that many of these places bother to use it. There are other slightly strange bindings that I won't go into. They're up there. That's the butterfly binding, and that's the sutra binding. But the idea that you can simply see in the technology how a shift happens and see it as a simple technological triumph is not actually what happens. And one way we can start to say, well, what are the forces at work here, is actually if we start to look at images like this. Here are some of the great Christian fathers of the church. And all of them have a book in their hand. And so many early paintings, you see that. And you will very rarely see them with a scroll in their hand. So we're looking, the acceptance of the Codex among Christianity is almost from the beginning of the spread of Christianity. And the acceptance of it among Islam is almost from the inception of Islam. Those two people get the Codex and start using it, particularly the Christians. So any pictures on why that might be the case? What were the Christians trying to do in some ways? Yes, Dan. And spreads as opposed to... So they want to spread their word. Now they're in kind of competition. Who else is out there? No, Islam is not really out there early on. It becomes out there. Pagan, so we have pagan religions and Judaism. All right, so those in some ways are the two dominant faiths in this area. And in many ways what is going on is these people are saying, I'm not one of those, by carrying this new form around. So you can see that Cavallo is saying, what in many ways for Christians, they saw authority and trust in the Codex. That pagans continue to regard it as a culturally inferior form. So they wouldn't take it on. In contrast, the great majority of Christian texts were already in the form of codices. So it's a kind of distinction. And indeed, among early Jews, it was almost a sign of unreliability. They said, look, all these codexes are coming out, you can't trust them. You don't know where they've been. You don't know what they've come from. They're trying to replicate our sacred texts. But from the very form it comes in, you shouldn't look at it and trust it. So what we see as a technological battle, in fact, is an enormously significant set of cultural battles. And so along comes Islam. And it's very quick to adapt to paper, which is useful for the Codex, but they also now are fighting against Judaism, and they're fighting against Christianity, and they're fighting against pagans, and they take one side and say, we'll take the Codex. And in that world where that battle is significant, the Codex spreads. In the world where that battle isn't significant, in China, in Korea, in Japan, it doesn't spread. It doesn't have that significance. So although there are technological explanations, don't hold on to those as the early ones, because there are other things going on that are quite complicated and important. Okay, so what's happening with the manuscript? Well, one thing again that the standard story will tend to tell us is that when the Codex comes along, when printing comes along, we get the book that we more or less know today, and we've been with that book ever since. In fact, within this week and next week, I'll be telling you that's really to misunderstand how change happened. Because almost all the things that we associate with the book really came about before printing. Readers changed, as I said, production changed. They moved out from the monasteries, they moved out among the lay people, they were used for things other than religious texts. And so, for that reason, there were a lot of things that people started to experiment with books. So you see, they started to have running heads. Running heads, we still recognize, the things that go across the top of a page that tell you what book you're in, what section of the book you're in. They started to subdivide into books and chapters. That happens all in manuscripts. They started to have tables of contents, particularly analytical tables of contents that told you not only what the divisions were, but what went on in each division. Chapter headings, cross-references, alphabetical order, page numbers, indexes. All these happen in the manuscript book. And this is more setting up for when we talk about print. Because one of the interesting things about print is it had some trouble replicating some of these things. So were easy in a manuscript, were hard to produce in the printed book. So when we often think of print as bringing in just this new technology, in fact it was adapting to an old one and had trouble adapting to it. Okay, so one other issue then, as we think now about the inscription of these texts. So, as I said, one reason the Codex spread was not because of technological superiority, but was because it was associated with particular ways of thinking, particular faiths, particular beliefs, particular religions. And that gave it a certain authority. There were other aspects to its authority too. That's clearly in the religious realm, but it starts to have also what look in part like the precursors of an information age. That is, we start to record facts and data more and more about people. So after the Normans conquer England, they set out for this thing called the Domesday Book, in which they're going to write down every piece of property, who owns it, who lives on it, what's on it, and you're going to be in that book or life will be hell, because you have no claim to the property you live on. So books start to represent an enormous sort of civil power as well as religious power. We start to get surveys of land, we start to get dates associated with these things. Well, he lived there then and they moved in later. Names become important. How do you identify you? How do you find yourself in a book? You tend not to have to go around your neighbors and say, who am I? Or what's my name? But if you know each other, but if you want to go and find yourself in one of these books that say you're entitled to live on this land, you have to have a name and you have to stick to that name, you have to know how it's spelled, and all that starts to spread. You start to have written evidence now that courts can start to say, well, we're not just going to take testimony from people, but we're going to look at these